What's up, guys? I'm Ryan Engler here with Sam Aleinikoff and Jake Mastbaum, and we're in Jacksonville, Florida, still at the NCAA tournament. This is the second episode of SlopeTV's preview show here at the tournament, and we're going to be previewing the game on Sunday between the 4th-seeded Wisconsin Badgers and the 12th-seeded Cornell Big Red. Obviously, yesterday, the Big Red of Cornell with their first win in the history of the program at the NCAA tournament. Very emotional win for all players involved. A great game, and we're gonna get right into tomorrow's game between Cornell and Wisconsin. Obviously, the Cornell players very happy with the win, but not satisfied. All of them hungry to continue to advance in the tournament, make their way to the Sweet 16. But in order to do that, they're gonna have to beat Wisconsin. So, one thing that was really big for Cornell yesterday was the three-point shooting in the second half. When they really got going, they started to knock down threes. Ryan Whitman hit 4 overall. They shot 39% from beyond the arc. And one thing that Coach Steve Donahue said in his press conference today was he did not think Cornell was going to be able to get the same amount of looks that they got yesterday. Seeing that three-point shooting has been big for the Big Red all year. How do you see it coming into play tomorrow against another tough defensive team in Wisconsin?
Well, I think first and foremost, obviously, Steve Donahue knows more about his team than anyone else does. But looking at Wisconsin and looking at Cornell, you see a vast difference in the way they defend the three. In Wisconsin, they give up threes at a pretty high clip. They're 140th in the country in giving up the three-point ball. And on the other side, Cornell, first in the nation in shooting the three-point ball. You got to expect that they're going to get some open shots, some open looks, and with the percentages that they knock them down at, you got to expect they're going to fall too.
Yeah, the point I want to talk about here is the fact that Wisconsin leads the nation in most games where their opponent scores under 50 points. There's 14 games where Wisconsin has held their opponent to under that number, and the reason for that is the style of basketball they play in the Big Ten. It's a slow, methodical game, a very defensive game, and the key, I think, here is not necessarily will Cornell get their shots up. It's Cornell being able to control the tempo of the game and making Wisconsin play their style of game, like Cornell basketball, rather than Cornell playing Wisconsin basketball. One of the things Chris Wrobleski said in the press conference is that Big Ten teams a lot of times only put 2 shooters on the court at once, where Cornell could put 4 shooters. So if Wisconsin can lock down, let's say, Dale and Chris, you just have Ryan Whitman and John Jakes able to shoot that three. You bring Jeff Reeves off the bench, who could really sling it from long range. He's another one of those guys who shoots over 40%. So I think the key point for Cornell is just making their style, making Wisconsin play their style.
Right, when we were talking about the Temple game, one of the things we talked about was tempo and whether Cornell was going to be able to get their tempo. They did yesterday, and that was part of the reason why the game really actually wasn't all that close. And another thing that was brought up in the press conference actually along these same lines was somebody mentioned the 2 games that Cornell had against Princeton and how, both of the Princeton games were kind of, Big Ten style games. Both of them were 3-point games under 50 points, and that might just be the type of game. And, Coach Donahue cited those games as very good experience for, playing a team like Wisconsin. So it'll be interesting to see if that experience is beneficial, and, I think it will be. But another thing that is going to be important tomorrow for sure, especially watching the game against Wofford yesterday. But John Lohr, one of the better players on this Wisconsin team. He's a 3rd-team All Big Ten selection. He's a 6'10" big guy that has the ability to step back and shoot. And, that's definitely something that may pose a problem for Cornell matchup-wise. Obviously, their biggest guy, Jeff Foote, the 7-footer, isn't that accustomed to playing on the perimeter. He can do it, but that's not necessarily his game. And then other than that, you kind of might be facing a mismatch if you put one of your smaller guys on him. How important is John Lohr going to be for Wisconsin's success? And is Cornell going to have to contain Lohr in order to win the game?
Well, let me just say, John Lohr is a matchup nightmare for the Big Red. I really believe that one of the top players in the Big Ten you have in Lohr, and even if you just watch the last few seconds of the Wofford game, Lohr stepping out on the baseline, making a shot from right inside the 3-point arc. That was really the dagger right there. That's the reason Wisconsin won that basketball game and moved on to the second round to play Cornell. You talk about the matchup. Jeff Foote played a little bit on the perimeter. You saw that in the Brown game when Matt Mullery played beyond the 3-point arc. That was actually one of Foote's lesser defensive efforts on the season, so it could be pose a problem there.
Mullery might be the closest thing we've seen to Lure all year.
Yeah, Foote actually talked about that today. We
Yeah.
had a chance to talk to him in the locker room just after the press conference. That's one of the things Foote talked about. He said, Mullery has given us some experience. And it's interesting, the way that Cornell played Mullery was to have Foote on him at times, but also at one point they had Curry come in and play some defense, Mark Curry, the transfer from Kentucky,
Yeah.
and he was successful too. So it's interesting who they're going to put on him. The other thing about Lure is he was injured for a large part of this year, and Keaton Nankivil, the four for this team, kind of got a lot more minutes, and his numbers skyrocketed with Lure on the bench. So they really can also spread the floor just like Cornell can. They got guys at every position. Cornell can shoot from 4 positions. Well, Wisconsin can do it from 5.
Yeah.
And that's going to cause problems for Cornell. But as much as that will cause problems for Cornell on the defensive end, Jeff Foote's going to cause huge problems for Wisconsin on the offensive end.
Absolutely.
I mean, Foote's a 7-footer, and he's 265 pounds with the weight he's put on this year and in the offseason. And when you look at Lure, he's just a much skinnier guy. He's going to have trouble defending a big 7-footer in the post. You got to assume that size difference is really going to cause problems.
And we've talked about in this analysis, we've talked about Wisconsin's defense, and we've talked about how Wisconsin's defense might pose problems for Cornell. But in order to win this game, is Cornell going to have to replicate the defensive effort that we saw yesterday?
I think that'll be key. And one thing that Cornell did that we hadn't seen quite as much of this year was they switched up their defenses a lot. I mean, we've seen them go from man to a matchup zone back to a more traditional zone in a 2-3 or a 1-3-1, but yesterday it was just every other possession it seemed like they were going into some different type of defense. And just that type of switching defense, I think, really energizes this team. It helps them to get in the passing lanes, get their hands up. And I think if they're able to replicate that type of effort, I think Cornell's going to cause all sorts of problems for Wisconsin. And maybe Lure won't be able to get into that same type of rhythm that he is, even if he does see some open looks. Maybe if Cornell can disrupt the rhythm a little bit, he won't be able to knock him down.
Well, the one thing about Wisconsin is that they just don't turn the ball over. Against Wofford yesterday, they only had 4 turnovers. Wisconsin has the least amount of turnovers per game in the country. We talked about them defending John Lure. I think another key from the defensive standpoint for the Big Red is preventing the penetration into the lane. Trayvon Hughes, one of the guards for Wisconsin, he averages over 15 points a game this year, really stepped up his level of play for his senior season. He had 19 points yesterday against Wofford, and this is a guy, kind of a similar guard to Lewis Dale, with his ability to attack the rim, gets into the paint, gets to the line, gets fouled. 16 of his 19 points yesterday came from either 2-point range or the foul line.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at guys like Lewis Dale, Chris Robleski, and Jeff Reeves. Steve Donahue said Robleski is his best on-ball defender. He said Reeves is his best off-ball defender. Those guys need to keep Hughes in front of them.
So with that, this has been another episode of Slope TV's NCAA Tournament pregame show. You can catch the game 2:50 tip-off tomorrow on CBS. We will be, Slope will be covering it. You can follow us on Twitter, SlopeCU Sports. Should be a great game. Until then, I'm Ryan Engler with Sam Aleinikoff and Jake Mastbaum. Thanks for watching, guys.